have been studying the US women's movement for most of my academic career. And so I first started by studying actually the National Organization for Women. I wrote my dissertation on how NAP chapters continue over time and what they mean to their community. And then after I finished that project, I started working on another project, which is the basis of my book. I don't know where that went. Maybe it's my book. And I started looking at what was going on in contemporary feminism. Because one of the things I kept hearing people tell me, and this has been probably for like around 15 years, everyone would say to me, young women and young men don't care about feminism. They're not feminists anymore. They're gone. The movement is over. But I was teaching women and gender studies classes, and I was running into young women and men who were identifying as feminists. So I thought, you know, I'm going to do a project where I look at kind of what's going on. And so I went to 3 different communities, and I looked at how feminism was being done. And I looked at also why we kept saying it was dead. And so I came up with the help of a really good editor, I came up with this title, Everywhere and Nowhere, that in the 21st century, one of the things that's happened with feminism is that it's so immersed in our society that we talk about girls being empowered, girls can do anything, we've changed the way we think about raising boys. Like all these kind of feminist ideas that were really pretty shocking in the 60s are now, we pretty much take them for granted. So they're kind of everywhere. Or as these 2 women wrote, they said, feminism is like fluoride, it's simply in the water, right? We're drinking it and we don't even know it. But at the same time, feminism is constantly being declared dead, right? It's over, it's not relevant anymore. And now, we're in this really interesting period of time where, what happened last weekend? What happened last weekend?
Time's up.
The women's marches, the 1-year anniversary of the women's marches, right? Where millions of women and men and people who don't identify on the gender binary marched all over the world. Okay, so now we're in this like totally interesting time that's so different than the time I started my book. So that's just a really long way of me saying this stuff is exciting to me, and I'm so glad you invited me here to kind of chat about it, because I love looking at it, and I love paying attention to what's going on, and I like kind of trying to figure out what's happening. So when Grace and I first started talking about what I could talk about, there's like so many things I could talk about. I thought, she said, well, we're kind of interested in issues about homophobia and racism. And so I thought maybe it would be helpful, thinking about the world we live in right now, for us to take a second, to take a little kind of historical tour, go back and think about how issues of racism, homophobia, and transphobia have been a part of feminism itself, not just outside the world, but in feminism itself, to think about as we go forward, we can start to strategize and think about how we want to leave these things behind. And so I don't know if you can see this, but does anybody know who's in these photos? Anyone recognize either one of these people?
Of an age.
I'm not calling on you though, because yes.
Gloria Steinem.
It's Gloria Steinem, yep. So this is Gloria Steinem, and this is Dorothy Pitts Hughes. And this first photo was taken in 1971. So this is not too long after the movement kind of starts up again in the late 60s. And they take this photo, and it's on the cover of Esquire magazine. And part of the reason they took this photo is that they wanted to show how white women and black women were united together and working on feminism at this time. So this becomes really an iconic photo. 2014, they get together again, and they recreate it. And so I think this is an interesting photo to kind of start our story with, because it makes us realize that some of the things we're going to talk about, particularly about racism, they're a little more complicated than the women's movement was racist. Okay, so let me show you. Where did the clicker go? Do you have the clicker, or did I? it up? Oh, here it is. Let's see if it works. Nope, I just turned it off. Other way. Top. Top one? There's not a lot. There's not a lot. So one of the things I think is so important, as somebody who studies the women's movement, oh my gosh, the history that you hear is like so incredibly wrong, or it's so simplified. So part of what I believe is that if you don't know the history of where you've come from, it's really hard to figure out where you're going. So one of the things I wanted to talk about were some of the issues that got embedded in the movement early on. And so I don't know if you can read this, but this is a editorial cartoon, and it's talking about the suffrage movement of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so what you see here is a white woman, and she's holding a sign that says "Votes for Women," but she's holding her hand here towards a black woman who's also holding the sign "Votes for Women," and holding her off, like interrupting it. So one of the things we have to recognize about the early years of the women's movement is that strategically, at times, some of the organizers argued that instead of allowing black men to vote, it would be better to allow white women to have the vote first, right? And so what we see is that some women use race and racism as a way of arguing that they deserve the right to vote before men of color. Well, as we know, it didn't really work out that way. That strategy never really worked out well. And not all women believe that. Not all women who are engaged in suffrage. And in fact, many of the women who got involved in the early years of the movement came from what we call the abolition or the anti-slavery movement is what brought them into it. So once again, a complicated story, but there is a history here of that issue of racism. So what ends up happening is that in 1920, we got the 19th Amendment. Women were granted suffrage, right? And I really hate it when people say women were given the right to vote, because they actually worked for decades, right, to gain the right to vote. There's a difference between being given something and working for it. But we also know that it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1964 that said that Southern laws that kept blacks from voting were discriminatory. So what we actually see when you talk to people about the history of race and suffrage, what we see is that white women actually were able to vote in 1920, but black women in the South were not able to vote freely until after 1964, 1965. So that's a legacy, right? That's part of the story that we have to think about. So where are we then today? Well, race is still a problem. Racism is still a problem, and part of that often comes from particularly white women not really thinking very clearly about their own racial privilege. So this sign here is from a demonstration called a slut walk that happened 2011, and a young woman took the lyrics of John Lennon has a song called "Woman is the," I'm going to use the N-word, "the nigger of the world." So she decides to write that on a sign, and then she decides to march and slut walk. And what she ends up doing is drawing an incredible amount of attention and criticism, because she's really taking a lyric and a problematic word and using it in a context that she's really kind of unthinkingly perpetuating racism. And she got so much social media attention that she actually kind of went into hiding after this, because people were so angry with her. But you can see that this is from a more recent march, and these are women of color who are holding a sign that says, Maybe we should add pumpkin spice to racism so white women will care. This is from 2015-16. So what we see is that those legacies of the past, those issues about race, the way in which we haven't, as a movement, has not always been thoughtful about race, and often tried to talk about things as people being universal women. The most important thing was that you were all women. And what that ended up doing is in ignoring the fact that not all women have the same social status, they have the same social privileges, the same social opportunities. And so for lots of women of color, this is an ongoing argument. And I was actually just on Facebook not too long ago. Somebody had posted an article all about white feminism, a critique of white feminism. So racism continues to be an issue that the feminist movement struggles with. Okay, so to continue our tour, so let's move on to homophobia. Homophobia is interesting, particularly in the women's movement. In the first, what we call the first wave of the women's movement that happened like in the 1860s, people didn't identify as gay. So homophobia really wasn't a big part of the discussions in the movement. But when we come back, the movement kind of reemerges in the 1960s. It becomes a huge issue in this country. Partially because there's also, at the same time, there's a women's movement, there's Black Power civil rights movement, and there's also a gay and lesbian movement, all happening kind of at the same time in this country. So what you see is you have lots of women who identify as lesbians joining the National Organization for Women, which is this brand new organization that starts in 1966. And who was the first president of NOW? Anybody know? It's Betty Friedan. Yes, Betty Friedan. Okay, yes, yay. So Betty Friedan, she's somebody that comes out of pretty conventional politics. She's a feminist. I mean, what she's saying is pretty radical in the 60s, but she really believes that women are going to get power through kind of assimilating into politics, assimilating into the workplace, right? And she starts worrying about women who are too openly lesbian detracting from the movement. And she calls them the Lavender Menace. Have you heard this? Yeah, she calls them the Lavender Menace. And what she's really calling them is, it's a lavender herring, like they're going to detract from. She also thought that the younger women the more radical women who started like growing their hair and they didn't shave, their legs, and they didn't wear bras, she kept calling them scruffy. And she kept wondering why they just didn't take better care of themselves, because she really thought a certain appearance and a certain kind of, presenting yourself in a certain way was going to help the movement. So what ends up happening is that her concern about lesbians and NOW becomes such a big deal that there's these major kind of purges of groups of women who leave and form different organizations. And some of those organizations go on to be some of the most radical of the time. But some of the women who stayed in NOW were really angry at what she was doing. And so they have this, I think it's 1971. So they go to a conference, and the lesbian group contingent manages to take over the stage. They turn off the lights, they come out onto the stage, and they all have these t-shirts that say Lavender Menace on them, and they turn up the lights, and it's this huge uproar, right? Because these lesbians have just taken over the conference, and then they leave. So, lots of homophobia, right? So what we see though, and the thing that we often forget when we talk about this, because people will tell you how homophobic NOW is, this happened in 1971. By 1973, NOW had added a plank to its platform that endorsed and worked for lesbian rights, had a woman who identified as a bisexual lesbian as president, had lesbian groups within it, and still does, right? So it's still very much a very gay affirmative organization. But it has that old history that hung around. And so people still, especially around NOW, but people still do talk about feminism at times as being homophobic or not very open to gays and lesbians. But let me tell you about just one other way this kind of worked out. Has anybody heard the term TERF? TERF? Yeah. What is a TERF? Do you know? Yep. Trans exclusionary radical feminists. And do you know who came up with this whole transgender people are bad feminists? Okay. Janice Raymond in the 70s writes a book called The Transsexual Empire. And what she claims is that women who transition to men, being trans men, are doing it to gain kind of patriarchal power, and that men who transition to be trans women are doing it for some sort of feminine gains, but will never truly be women, and is very, very radically against transgender. This idea that once you're born a woman and you live life as a woman, you can never ever experience what it is to be a man, and vice versa. So Janice Raymond is very, very clear on this. And so what ends up happening is that over time, anyone who identifies as a radical feminist is seen as being a TERF, meaning that you are excluding trans people from housing, employment, education, accommodation, equality, as well as local, state, national, and United Nations protections. And this has its roots in the 70s and continues today. So lots of feminists are very open to including trans people, trans men and trans women, into their organizations. But the Women's Music Festival up in Hart, Michigan, that just ceased a couple years ago, they had a woman-born women-only policy. So if you had transitioned to being a woman, you were not allowed on the property. And so they had a camp across the street, Camp Trans, that protested the festival for years. So we saw that happening, that was happening in the 2000s. And today, I have a friend who teaches at Smith, and people talk about and label people as TERFs. So this idea of how do we think about transgender, and this idea of transphobia is still one of these issues that's kind of embedded in the movement. What does it mean to step outside of the gender binary? What does it mean to identify in a way that you weren't born? Can you really understand what it's like to be a woman? What happens, when you no longer want the category of woman? So, I mean, they bring up all these kind of ideological, but really important kind of discussions that are still going on today that started in the 70s. And some of those terms still hang around. Okay. So, what's the solution? So what we know is that in the history of feminism, which I've given you like the world's fastest, and most depressing aspects of feminism, there's many wonderful things that happened. But some of the ways in which kind of the feminist movement has stumbled. It stumbled about race and being inclusive and acknowledging privilege. It stumbled about class, which hardly anybody talks about the movement as being classes, but you think about social class, thinking about the lives of working women, thinking about the lives of women in unions and how their lives are different than women who are white-collar workers. So there's many ways that the movement has stumbled. And one of the ways I think a solution that's out there is this idea of intersectionality. Have people familiar with intersectionality? Oh, I love it. You've got to come to my college classes, right? Intersectionality is this idea that comes out of women of color, and particularly black feminists, in the 80s, began to look around them and say, okay, wait a minute. This universal woman thing is just not getting it, because you, lady who just drove you here in your Cadillac, and me, who just took the bus to the same meeting, we're not living the same life. So how do we articulate how our lives are different? And so people like Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, The Combahee River Collective is one of the first groups that actually begins to talk about this. They begin to talk about this idea of intersectionality. And the idea that we are always more than one thing. We as people are a complex relationship of categories. So it's not like you add them together, right? And so, you know, some people have more negatives and some people have more positives, and whoever has the most negatives is at the bottom, and whoever has the most positives is at the top. That's kind of this pyramid view. So Black feminists said, you know, the reality is that we all have these social categories: our age, our race, our sex, our gender identity, our social class, our religion, our ethnicity, right? Our ableness. All of these things are constantly in interaction with each other. And so what we are then is very complicated. And I like this, I don't know if you can see this little graphic, but when you take an intersectional lens, it takes woman and then puts it through and it gives you this kaleidoscope, right? It just starts to divide it up and it makes it more real. I was just at the Women's March in Lansing, and I had gone to that same march a year ago, and there are so many signs there that say, it's not feminism if it's not intersectional. I went to the women's convention that was held here in Detroit. Almost every speaker that got up said, I'm an intersectional feminist. So part of what that means is people are starting to try to think about, how do we not just make each other one thing, but how do we actually look at each other for the complexity of who we are, and to think about how that complexity changes over time. Because one of the things you are right now is not old, right? Someday you will be old, right? And that age and the relationship to all those other identities changes how you function in the world and how people treat you. This idea that when we move from being able-bodied to being disable-bodied, if we suffer from illness, right? If we get conditions that change the way we move through the world, that interacts with all the other categories about us, so that we don't just often look at people and see one thing. We see multiple things. So intersectionality is a way to get past thinking, this is who I'm fighting for, this group of people, because it makes it so much more complex. So that's one of the things I think is the most interesting. Now I have to say, when I was at the Women's Convention, almost everybody defined intersectionality differently. So I don't think we're working on a definition here, but it's not bad. So the other thing I wanted to show you is that there was an article written by a woman named Ellen Scott. And she looked at how do you make a diverse organization? How do you move past just making it look like the people that you spend all your time with? How do you make something that really kind of embraces this idea of intersectionality? And she had some ideas I think are good. First of all, you have to make a commitment to diversity. And you have to think about how you bring diversity into leadership. However you want to think about who's the leader or what kind of diversity you're interested in, but you have to have that conversation at the very top. She also says you need some sort of organizational structure that supports diversity. So if you have an e-board or a council or some sort of steering committee, who's on it? How do you decide who's on it? How do you bring in the people who may be kind of at the outskirts of the organization? How do you embed that in the organization? And it has to be more than just whoever's the leader deciding to do it. It has to be a part of kind of the rules and the procedures. We also know, and I learned this when I did my study for Everywhere and Nowhere, because almost every young feminist I interviewed said, we want a more diverse movement. We want a more diverse community. And almost every place I went to was not diverse, right? They wanted it so badly but they didn't know how to get it. And one of the things I realized that the most diverse communities of feminists were the ones who lived in the most diverse communities. When their actual neighborhood, we're talking about neighborhoods, we're talking about grocery stores, we're talking about your library, we're talking about how you spend your days and who you walk past has a lot to do with who's going to be in your organization. Because we tend to organize in groups that reflect the neighborhoods we live in. And so one of the ways in which you get more diversity is you find a way to open up kind of your networks to be more diverse. And when I moved here, I came from upstate New York, and when I moved here to this area, to Southeast Michigan, people would tell me who lived in what community. Oh, that Hamtramck, that's where the Polish people live, right? And, you know, and then they would tell me not flattering names of all these places, like Bloomfield Hills, that's where these people live. And Detroit, that's where these, right? Dearborn, that's where these people live. Everybody could tell me the racial or ethnic breakdown of every community around me. And so what that says to me is that one of the challenges for organizing in this area is to figure out how to open up your networks, right? How to have a bigger network. So if you want you know, a racially diverse group, you got to figure out how do we have networks that are also racially diverse. Or it could be diversity in other things. The other mistake I see people make is when they say diverse, they mean race all the time. And when they say gender, they mean women. So, you know, think about like what, you know, having people outside the gender binary is a way of being diverse. Having people who identify on a continuum of sexuality is another way of being diverse. There's lots of ways of being diverse, but thinking about who's in your neighborhood. And then the other part I think is so important is learning histories. If you want to have a diverse group, understand the history of that group. So you're not going to have a let's celebrate the 19th Amendment party with a group of women of color who feel like they didn't really get the right to vote till 1965. It doesn't work that way. If you want to talk about how to think about dealing with the LGBTQ community, know that history. Know who has felt marginalized in that history, know how that history's been different. I have a friend who wrote a book called Different Pathways to Feminism, and she traces organizations by Latina, Chicana, and Black women that organized the same time in the 1960s as organizations like now. Those organizations never show up in feminist histories. Only Now shows up, and a few other organizations of predominantly white women. That history, she calls it, has been whitewashed. And what we've left out are all the people who were actually doing intersectional feminism at a time when you know, the history books are only collecting what white women were doing. So, you know, knowing those histories gives you an opportunity to say, okay, I don't know why we don't have any, you know, I don't know, Japanese women in our organization. Well, what's their history? What sort of history that tells you kind of the secret to some of those things. So that's kind of all I had to say. Do people have any questions or comments or anything else I could elaborate on? Yeah.
I just had a question for you personally. Was there like a specific moment in your life or some event that kind of got you started your interest in feminism and social justice?
You know, that's a great question. You know, a lot of people that I interviewed talked about like never really, you know, when the movement started in the 60s, women would talk about the click moment. So they'd be like, I was walking up the stairs with a load of laundry, and my husband said, don't forget to pick up my socks that you just dropped, and click, I thought, why don't you pick up your own socks? And then I became a feminist, right? And so people used to write into Ms. Magazine with their click moments, and they were often things like, and then, you know, I'm in the kitchen, and everybody's sitting at the table going, we're hungry, and I'm thinking, why can't you get your own food? Click, I became a feminist. I never really had a click moment. And a lot of people, instead I think sometimes people are like surfacing, they're kind of like living in a feminist world, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, I'm a feminist. I remember though, in the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s, the Equal Rights Amendment was, they were trying to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and it was in the news a lot. And there was very strong pro-Equal Rights Amendment and very strong anti-Equal Rights Amendment. And Phyllis Schlafly, who just recently died, she was one of the people arguing against it, and she argued that if we had the Equal Rights Amendment, women would have to go to war, and we would have to have unisex bathrooms. And I remember thinking very seriously, you know, and I was like 13, thinking very seriously that I probably would be okay with having the Equal Rights Amendment. It would be a good thing, and I could probably stand going to school and using a unisex bathroom. And I think that's when I became a feminist, because I was like, you know what? Empowerment, privacy in the bathroom, I'll go for empowerment. So I think, you know, I think that's it. I've always been fascinated in social movements, which is what I did most of my graduate work in. I like to think about how the world changes and the ways in which people make the world change. I always feel like that's kind of hopeful. And so, and I was a feminist in graduate school. I was a feminist activist before I went back to graduate school. So having an opportunity to kind of study who I was, or the world around me was a good opportunity. So thanks for asking that. It was a great question. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question. I don't know if I'm worded properly. Like, how do you react to like those who kind of have a negative connotation about feminism, or like when you try to explain what it is and they kind of have that like a they don't understand it well, I guess. Like, how do you react to that? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I've spent a lot of my adult life explaining what I mean when I say I'm a feminist. I gave a talk one time to an honors college class, and I was there to talk about something completely different, and I introduced myself as a feminist researcher, and it was like 18 hands went up. Why do you hate men? It was like negative, 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 and I spent a good 20 minutes like saying, this is why I call myself this. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Feminism has a really bad reputation. There's all these stereotypes. And if I said, I'll give $100 to the person who can write down the most, I think you all could fill a piece of paper with stereotypes, right? No sense of humor, only wears flannel, doesn't shave their legs, hates men, right? And sadly, that hasn't changed a whole lot. Some of that is, you know, some of those things, those ideas, come from kind of like the early years of the movement when there were women who were really mad, who were really protesting appearance norms, who did stop shaving their, you know, like, so there's like a little bits of like, there was stuff going on, but then it got made into this stereotype and it got slathered on everyone. And I also think that any movement that tries to challenge the status quo, to change the world we live in, gets negatively attacked. There's a sociologist, she calls it soft repression. And soft repression is when you take a social movement or you take activists and you ridicule them, right? So I don't know if anybody remembers Occupy. Do you remember the Occupy Wall Street? They made fun of Occupy. They don't know what they want. They're just a bunch of dirty, unwashed people camping out, and this is ridiculous. But that's a form of repression, just like bringing a tank in and saying, we're going to shut down your demonstration, right? That's hard repression. So what do you say to that? I think one of the most liberating things I learned is that it's not my job to educate everyone about how I understand feminism. I may choose to define it and move on. Now, I'm a professor, and I'm in a classroom, and if I'm teaching about feminist blah, 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 that is my job. But when I call myself that, or I act in a way, and people respond to it negatively, I get to decide, is this someone that I want to spend my time on and explain what it is that I mean? Because in reality, when you tell people, I believe in equality between all people, and I believe in the end of oppression for all people, who's going to argue with that, right? Then they start bringing up other parts. And there may be things that you believe in that other people don't, but that's okay. That's the world we live in. So, you know, you have the right to say, this is what I choose to believe, and you can believe whatever you want. I think a lot of times people get into that because they want to kind of bait you into a conversation. And that's where, I mean, like sometimes you can just say like, oh, I'm not going to play. I'm not interested. So thinking about kind of choosing the moments that you want to have those conversations, I think is really liberating. That identifying as a feminist doesn't mean you have to tell everybody all the time what you mean by that. Because we don't do that to anybody else. You know, we don't do that, you know, are you a Christian? Are you a Muslim? Are you a Hindu? What does that mean? What does that mean? How do you identify that? Where do you go? You know, we don't do that, right? We're like, okay. And then if you want to have a conversation with me about what that means, that's cool. So I think, you know, that's a way of kind of making you seem like the enemy, or seem like the other, or seem like someone who's like kind of wacky, when the world we live in, you know, we live in a better world. I truly believe this. We live in a better world because of feminism. You talked about Larry Nassar and the judge who's allowing those 140 women to give testimonies. That's a better world. That's a horrible, horrible thing that happened, but she is allowing those women their voice. And that's what feminism is about. It's allowing people their voice. You know, allowing them to heal, allowing them to come to terms with their own life, take control of their lives back. That's all about feminism. So, you know, how much I want to argue with people, I decide. You're in my classroom, I'll talk until I'm blue in the face, because that's my job. But it's not my job all the time. Does that help?
Yes, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Other questions? Comments? Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It was very fun to talk to you.